I did have a question that sort of relates back to our brief to the architects and the site that we proposed for the brief, because it's a different kind of site to this, which is sort of medium density, medium rise.
Mm-hmm.
And the city is another place entirely, of course. To make a project on that site sustainable, we need to look at high rise and high density a bit more. And so how do you feel how's it going to be possible to keep a sense of community or create a sense of community when you've got much higher rise developments of that sort?
I think that's always been a bit of a challenge, because you only really have connection with the ground up to about 5 stories. After that, you start to lose it. So I think the secret is in the way that we deal with the ground plane. And so both on that site and I was just mentioning to Andrew before we met, on the Munro site, which is close to the Queen Victoria Market, we've spent a lot of time looking at the connections through the site, the new lanes, the new open spaces, the activity that takes place around the ground level. And one of the challenges you've got in the city at the moment is that a lot of the sites that are being developed were never meant to be developed. The smaller sites, if the minister had kept the setbacks in place, would have been too small to develop, but they got removed and now they've just sort of come back recently. So you get a very tall building on a very small site, and all you get around the base is, the substation and the garbage collection and, everything else, which doesn't make for a very exciting city. So those are the challenges with it. But when you get a bigger site like the site your project is on, you have, I think, the ability to create something interesting around the ground plane. And in the work that we've been doing on buildings like CH2 and one we're designing for the council at the moment, almost 100% of the ground plane is active, with the exception of one entrance into a car park below. Everything else is underground. And I think that's the challenge we've got to bring. And the beauty of your project is you've already got that ability to do that.
Yeah, exactly. But we always want to activate the ground plane, and it is those elements that, like the garbage collection, that do pop up and start to create those inactive moments. So it is coming up with innovative solutions of how to deal with those sort of everyday objects as well. Looking at other cities, a lot of them, like you're doing Council House, put it underground. Sometimes we can't always do that, but it's always those challenges. And we were talking earlier about power companies and substations and how do we get those undergrounds, and so it's engaging with those people as well to create change for our cities. It's not just between architect and council and the city and the state, it is also all these other authorities that we have to engage with.
I think the thing that I like most about the project is it sets the paradigm for the future. Here you are doing adaptive repurposing of a building, and the challenge that Melbourne's got is how do you adapt and repurpose the whole metro area? Because the facts are we just haven't got the time to do anything other than do that. If the population doubles in the next 30 years, you can't build enough stuff. So you've got to come back on yourself and say, how do we take what we've got and adapt and reuse that? And a lot of people will say that's pretty boring. I mean, as architects, I think sometimes we love to just knock stuff over and build something that's new. And when I was thinking of this evening, I realised in my career, I haven't built anything in other council house too that's absolutely new. Most of it has been repurposing streets, repurposing buildings. And the excitement of having that combination between old and new is something that I think that is really exciting, and
yeah,
you
definitely.
can see it in your project.
Yeah, and I think it's adding those layers to existing built fabric that make it interesting, that make it unique, that make it, or maintain the memories that people form with our streets. When, like, you go to Franklin Street and around that part of Elizabeth Street, it's unrecognisable in a lot of ways. I think there've been some good elements that happen at ground plane, a lot of negatives as well. But I think maintaining as much as possible, adding layers, adding character, adding history, building upon what's already existing is a really powerful thing. And I think it's something that doesn't happen enough.
And the contrast between the new and the old is always an exciting tension.
Yeah, it is. It's a real challenge.
You know, quite often you walk into something and expecting it to be old, and you get into the interior and you know, it's actually not old, it's actually new.
Yeah.
And that can be exciting. But at a city level,
How do you replicate that in a new building?
well,
And a very tall building, potentially.
well, I'm thinking even broader than that. I mean, I was writing an article at the moment, and the challenge was, if overnight we said that we had petrol rationing, and you didn't have the default that we always make to things like freeways, or just kicking the problem down the road, how would you solve that problem, and what would be the outcome? And the answer to that is you would actually impose things like congestion charging. And everybody said, oh, but that's too hard. Well, I happen to live in a country where overnight we got petrol rationing. And within 2 weeks, we knew our neighbours, we actually shared cars, we helped the people who needed help because we knew they needed help, and we suddenly discovered they needed help because they couldn't get around. Yeah. And the whole country changed in the way that it actually treated itself. The same happened with water rationing here. And, you know, we all adapted and actually felt quite proud of adapting. Yeah. And along comes the next government and says, we don't need this anymore.
No, that's right.
Well,
but it had quite a long-term effect, I think, on lots of people.
It did.
Once you've dealt with that,
yeah,
you continue to sort of watch your water use.
Yeah. And so the answer to your question, how do you deal with the tall buildings? Well, quite frankly, we've got enough of them. You know, we don't have to, in Melbourne, build any more tall buildings above 8 stories and double the population. And so we need to stop thinking about, you know, saying this all has to happen in this place. It can happen in a whole lot of places. It can happen at every railway station. Yep. You know, and you know, many dense cities, including cities like Barcelona, are only 8 stories, and yet they're the densest cities in the world.
And the precedent of having some of these very tall, skinny buildings needs to be dealt with, I guess, because there's a question of scale, isn't there? When you've got all those tall buildings, how do you then introduce new developments that deal with that scale and keep a sense of community or build a sense of community in such a dense area?
Yeah, and I think it's to your point earlier about the ground plane. It's bringing people down and giving them space to gather and congregate and get together. Where a lot of the tall buildings, they just have a little coffee shop, and you can go to that coffee shop, or you can go to the other coffee shop, or the other. I think there needs to be more public realm, which is great what you're doing with the City of Melbourne, with a lot of the new parks in linear parks around the cities, giving people places to gather where they can't in their building apartments. Like a lot of people talk about roof terraces and all these outdoor spaces, which might be great in tall buildings. I think Melbourne's a windy city, and a lot of people forget that those spaces aren't actually occupiable. Whereas when you are down at 8 or 10 or even 12, you can have those activated spaces. Which I think it's a great point that if we kept having more low scale, 8 stories, 10 stories, then you create a lot more opportunity for activation, not just at street level, but also at the podium level or the rooftop. Jeremy, who you had in yesterday, is a great example of what he's doing at Nightingale with activating his rooftop spaces, giving people more amenity in their apartment buildings that a lot of people, are, unfortunately, in the City of Melbourne are lacking at the moment because of the height. So I think it would be a fantastic move if we saw more of that. But I think there's still this mentality in the City of Melbourne to push for height and to maximise profits, often to the detriment of the rest of the city.
Well, you see Matthew Guy coming out yesterday and saying, you know, if he gets into government, he'll remove all the controls that have just been put in place, and we'll be back on another rampage.
Yeah.
You know, so there is an inability, I think, at governments to think beyond the 4 years, and things get driven by simple stats like jobs, and we all know jobs are important. But in actual fact, the economy of the globe is being driven by cities at the moment. And that economy will not be sustained by areas where you lose the amenity of those areas. So it's a short-term sugar hit to actually say we can just actually get a few jobs for the next 4 or 5 years. If we actually destroy the thing that's actually going to create the economy for the next 100, 150 years. And that's the challenge with the politicians, is to get them to think beyond the 4-year parameters. And we see it, it's not just Australia, it's around the world. I mean, the whole climate debate, is about defaulting to procrastination. We'll leave it, we've got 30 years to keep the temperature down to 1 degree. So we'll do it next year, or we'll do it in 5 years' time. The interesting thing is the cities, I think, are taking on that challenge and basically saying, actually, we can't wait. And the cities and states are doing what federal governments aren't doing.
Yeah, definitely.
As they are in America.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think with the new buildings as well across the city, I think it would be fantastic if, like, this is a lesson we've learned from Younghusband, is to have that flexibility of like a floor-to-floor height, or that flexibility designed into the building, because we know that often a residential building might get turned into an office building, or vice versa. I think if we could, as designers and architects, allow for that flexibility, that repurposing in the future that we can't necessarily predict. But I think it's the City of Melbourne started to do as that new control about car parking height. If it's above ground, that it's got to be a greater floor-to-floor height, so it can be repurposed. I think that's something that would be great to see more of happening across the city, so we can be adding layers to our built fabric rather than going through and steamrolling through each time when we need to bump up the density or bump up the height.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting example you use there, because, I mean, for many years we argued for all the parking to be below ground, and I think many of our planning officers still do, where if you're going to repurpose it in 10 years' time, it's much really better above ground.
Yeah.
Flat-floored,
Exactly.
with decent ceiling heights, and then you could actually, it would become the most valuable space on that building because it's close to the ground. And if you want to see a building that didn't do that and now is semi-redundant, you go to the Barbican in London, and all the ceiling heights in their car parks were very low. So you've got this fantastic, groovy residential area right in the middle of London, and all the space that's unoccupied or used for storage. And so I think there's that, absolute need to think what happens next in the space.
Yeah, exactly.
And these buildings actually allow that flexibility.
Yeah,
because
they
they
do.
had that sort of, the generous ceiling heights, the big floors, and you can just about use them for anything.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're trying to design for and allow for, even with the work that we're doing, that if someone comes along and it needs to be something else, that it can be undone, unbolted, redone. And from a sustainability point of view as well, it means we can take those building materials out, put them back in as we need to, and I think that's something that needs a little bit more thought in people as they approach buildings in the city particularly.
And another area that comes up and has come up in the responses to our brief for this exhibition, as well as in this project that you're doing, is consultation with community, and that just seems to be it's a growing kind of device for architects.
Yeah,
We're
definitely.
hearing a lot more about architects going to the community and speaking to the community and really learning from them what it is that they want. And the theme of this exhibition is built by all, and I think that is something it's really quite topical. No,
definitely, and I think that adds so much more to a design than what. Like, for example, I don't live in Kensington, I live in East St Kilda, and I'm not familiar with all the nuances of that area, but having that consultation, having those discussions, and just having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee after those meetings and talking to people, you find out so much more, and you go, oh wow, I didn't know that. You would love to get this road closed, so they're talking about closing some of the roads around it to help the residents, and it's also going to have a net benefit on the project as well. So you get all these amazing ideas but also you get people feeling a little bit more comfortable about new developments coming to areas. I think more often than not, the first time they find out about a project is when that slip comes in the mail, and there's a 20-storey building coming next door. But if those residents had a chance to have those discussions and say, actually, 20 stories or 10 stories might be okay there, but maybe around this edge, think about that little area where the kids play, or that you don't know as an architect or developer, and you can influence the design and have a positive impact. Or they might point to a laneway that's used in a certain way, and we can redesign. And the more discussion and more conversation, the richer the outcome, I think.
That's right. And that's something that Jeremy brought up in regards to Nightingale, you know,
Yeah.
that the power of the people once they know, and if they're involved in the process, then the process is much quicker.
Yep.
And you know, social media has been extraordinary in the development of some of the, particularly when it came to the car spaces within that project and the lack of. The council, you know, there were issues with that, and
Yep.
the community really got behind that, and it was unanimous.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, they
And
were happy.
We had the same experience with the Younghusband. Everyone thought they'd seen a previous permit there for towers that were residential. They thought we were bringing a residential project to the area. We weren't. They were worried about, you know, how much we're going to change the building. We weren't. So we allayed those fears, and in the end ended up getting a letter of support from the residents of the Kensington Residents Association. That doesn't normally happen. They're quite vocal in their opposition to development, but they were supportive, and we're engaging with them again for the next stage, and they'll have a different view on that potentially, but it's a much better process to go through.